Welcome to the Metabolic Classroom. I'm Professor Benjamin Bikman. I'm a biomedical scientist and professor of cell biology. Today, I'm diving into a fascinating and complex topic, and that is the relationship between sleep and metabolic health. Now, before I go further, I want to remind you about the launch of my new site, benbikman.com. At benbikman.com, you can subscribe to become a basic insider or a pro insider with different content and access available at both levels. Regardless of whichever level you choose, it is an essential way to stay up to date on the latest science related to metabolic health. If you want to learn more, please go to benbikman.com. All right. Now, in today's lecture, as I just mentioned, I want to explore how sleep contributes to insulin resistance, including the roles of certain expected and unexpected hormones, as well as how dietary habits and light exposure can impact sleep quality. And some of that will be expected, but some unexpected. But finally, we're going to discuss some new research on the role of, some other aspects of nutrient metabolism and the way that affects the brain, and how when the brain is nourished in interesting ways, it'll sleep a little better. All right, let's get started. Just to establish a good foundation, let's just review why sleep matters for metabolic health in the first place. Sleep is essential for overall health, of course. If you don't get enough, in fact, if you're sleep deprived for days, it is lethal. You'll die. So no surprise that it plays a critical role in overall health. What is a little surprising is just how connected sleep is with metabolic health. During deep sleep, the body restores insulin sensitivity. You have an aspect of cellular repair with some autophagy and the balancing of various hormones that regulate appetite and energy. Now, in the broader view or the broader context of metabolism, sleep is accurately viewed as a catabolic state. Remember, metabolism or metabolic processes are a balance or is a balance of catabolic or the breakdown of stuff versus anabolic, which is the building up. So sleep is a catabolic state, one where the body is slowly breaking things down. Now, that's not bad. That's a good thing. Healthy function at the level of the cell is a balance of these metabolic processes, building up and breaking down. Now, of course, when you think about metabolism and specifically catabolism, that is anathema to insulin. Insulin abhors breaking things down. Thus, if the body wants to break something down or to have a predominantly catabolic state, insulin needs to be low. Now, this is all background. This is just some basic information to help cue up the topic that we'll get into deeper more in just a moment. But of course, when sleep is disrupted, these processes are disrupted. And then it's no surprise to learn that you have an increased risk of insulin resistance, obesity, type 2 diabetes, and more. And we're going to review the mechanisms and many of these unexpected links over the next several minutes together. But at the end of it all, you'll learn quickly how sleep deprivation can effectively and powerfully disrupt metabolic health, most especially insulin sensitivity. Now, just as a reminder, why do I focus so much on insulin resistance? It's because it is both the most common problem worldwide within the United States, and it's not as bad here as it is even in other countries. It is estimated that up to about 88% of all adults have some degree of insulin resistance that's manifesting in a clinically relevant way. But beyond even how prevalent the problem is, it is relevant insofar as insulin resistance is a fundamental, indeed in many instances, primary cause of several chronic diseases. All right, so that's why, if you are not overly familiar with me, I come back to that topic so often. All right, with that background in mind, let's transition to discuss how poor sleep can promote insulin resistance. So what exactly happens in the body when we don't get enough sleep? Other than feeling tired, of course, one immediate impact is cortisol. Cortisol, you've heard of, and you've heard of it in the context of stress, appropriately so. Cortisol is one of the body's primary stress hormones. Cortisol typically follows a daily rhythm, like many hormones do, where it's ebbing and flowing throughout a 24-hour period. And what it will normally do is peak in the early morning, around 4 a.m. or so. And that shifts a little bit depending on the person. And this coincides generally around the time it's kind of priming the body metabolically to wake up. So it's getting things online. In particular, when the nervous system is about to come online, it's going to, as cortisol comes up, it's going to start to increase glucose, which is going to provide an energy for the body to start using as it gets mobile again. However, when we're sleep deprived, the rhythm is disrupted with increased cortisol now in the early part of the day. So cortisol peaks a little later, so it starts to shift that peak, but then it stays high. What used to be sort of a gentle up and down, and then another one maybe a little later, it comes up a little later. So we've shifted that window of cortisol climbing. Let's just say perhaps it was 4 a.m. in a healthy state. Now it's 6 or 7 a.m. But then it will stay up. You lose that cresting and the cortisol coming back down. Now, the relevance of cortisol in a metabolic state, specifically insulin resistance, is something I have discussed abundantly in the past. And for the sake of allowing this lecture to be its own topic, I'm not going to revisit that in too great of detail, but I'll touch on it a little bit right now, but go no further. So if you're interested, look at my past metabolic classroom lectures that really looks at the role of stress in particular. But suffice it to say, when it comes to metabolic health and cortisol, cortisol is a metabolic wrecking ball. Two particular things worth mentioning. First, it promotes insulin resistance very, very quickly and potently by activating the synthesis of very biologically active lipids called ceramides. You've heard me talk about ceramides before. Ceramides, as you'll recall, are these lipids that will directly within a cell, so a type of fat, and there are hundreds of thousands of different types of lipids within every cell. So none of this is to say that lipids or fats are the problem here. Ceramides are a very particular type, but ceramides will basically block the insulin cascade. When insulin comes and binds to its receptor, and then there's a series of events that will follow, ceramides block that. It's kind of like putting the stick in the spokes of the bike. All right, now the second thing that happens is that cortisol will stimulate gluconeogenesis. Gluconeogenesis, as the name suggests, is the production of glucose, specifically from the liver. So when gluconeogenesis is turned on, which cortisol does, it will lead to the liver dumping out glucose, making it from scratch or breaking down the stored glucose, which was glycogen. But that's pushing glucose up in the blood, which of course in turn is going to push insulin up more in the blood. And the more insulin is getting pushed up, the more the body is insulin resistant. Okay, so that explains how poor sleep promotes insulin resistance. It is primarily a function of cortisol. Now, that was the expected hormone. In my introduction, you might have noticed that I said expected and unexpected. Well, that's the expected one. The unexpected hormone here is melatonin. So let's talk for a few minutes about the role of melatonin in sleep and metabolism. Melatonin is probably the most famous sleep hormone. It's well known as the hormone that regulates the sleep-wake cycle. And in that context, it's a little surprise to discuss it, but it also has a role in metabolism that is rarely mentioned. Now, by way of background, melatonin is produced by the pineal gland, a very, very small gland tucked in the depths of the brain. And it will increase, melatonin will come from the pineal gland in response to darkness and other signals that will generally help the body wind down or prepare it for rest. One of the most relevant processes that melatonin mediates to help the body prepare for sleep is that it will reduce body temperature. Body temperature is very important. It is a topic that we're going to revisit in just a few minutes, but when the body is too hot, it is actually one of the most common causes of insomnia or generally poor sleep or sleep disruption. Lots of different names for different ways of describing poor sleep. But melatonin is helpful in this process, again, because it cools the body down. All right. Now, separate from its obvious and famous effects on regulating sleep, melatonin is well known to alter insulin secretion and insulin signaling, thus having a very clear and direct impact on glucose metabolism and overall metabolic health and insulin signaling. melatonin has some specific receptors called the melatonin 1 and melatonin 2 receptors, MT1 and MT2, as it's often abbreviated. But through these receptors, both of them, MT1 and MT2, melatonin inhibits insulin secretion. It does so by specifically suppressing a mediator named cyclic AMP that is necessary within the beta cell. So the beta cells are what's producing insulin in the first place. The beta cell needs elevated cyclic AMP in order to release its insulin, but melatonin kind of keeps that, it dampens that a little bit. So with melatonin's going up, it generally wants to keep insulin in check. This inhibition, no surprise, aligns with melatonin's circadian rhythm, and it would, of course, be in a very obvious way, where when melatonin levels rise, like they do during the night, no surprise that at the same time there's this inverse relationship with insulin, as melatonin is providing a bit of an inhibition on insulin secretion. No surprise that when you look at the ebbing and flowing of melatonin, insulin is going to go in the opposite direction. So as melatonin levels go higher during the night, that, no surprise, correlates with reduced insulin. And this is something that will support the overall fasted state of sleeping, or the catabolic state, where that is a time for the body to start to, well, activate autophagy and sort of clean itself out. That is one way of looking at catabolic processes. But when this rhythm is disrupted, like you have with irregular sleep patterns or disrupted sleep or insomnia, this, of course, can increase the risk of metabolic disorders like type 2 diabetes because of this failure to control insulin. In fact, there are known genetic variants in melatonin receptors that have been linked to impaired insulin secretion, or the impaired ability of melatonin to regulate insulin secretion, and as a result, give a higher likelihood of developing type 2 diabetes. Now, as I mentioned a moment ago, with melatonin's role in this story doesn't end there. In addition to regulating insulin secretion, melatonin influences insulin signaling by modulating the pathways or the cascade where insulin binds its receptor and then tells the cell to start to do stuff. What happens specifically is that melatonin improves insulin sensitivity by preventing some disruptive phosphorylation. Now, I've talked about this previously, but when I talk about the insulin signaling cascade, you can think of it as a set of dominoes where you've stacked them up. You remember doing this as a kid. You've stacked up the dominoes, and one domino tips into another, which in turn tips into another, and so on. The comparison or the parallel within the cell would be one molecule generally phosphorylating another one, and then that one phosphorylates another one. That's an overly simplistic way, but it's not totally wrong. But with what can happen is that you can have a signal disrupt this if one of those molecules gets phosphorylated in the wrong place. This is something that has been shown to happen at the what's called insulin receptor substrate, or IRS1. That's at the very top of this cascade. So right when insulin comes and knocks on the door, IRS1 is essentially the first one to respond. And what melatonin does is help it respond better by making sure that something doesn't come in and interrupt it. Beyond that, or in addition to it, or complementary to that, is that melatonin directly enhances receptor activity. So it makes the insulin receptor more responsive. Now, lest that seem like a bad thing, we want insulin to work. We want insulin to do its job so that the levels of insulin don't need to be high for long. The more insulin is able to come into the body, and you have an insulin rise, and I don't want you to ever think that that is inherently pathogenic. There's nothing wrong with insulin coming up. We just want it to come back down. We don't want it to have to stay elevated for hours. That's when problems follow. So, with all of this in mind, where melatonin suppresses insulin secretion from the pancreas, which allows the body to also, in addition to all of this, shift its fuel. You'll recall that I've discussed previously that when there are two primary fuels in the body, glucose and fat. Now, there are other fuels like ketones and lactate, but these are the primary fuels, glucose and fat. When insulin is up, the body's glucose burning. When insulin is down, the body is fat burning. That is the relevance of insulin in the so-called Randle cycle, named after Philip Randle, or also known as the glucose fatty acid cycle. That's what he called it. But in this case, where melatonin is gently inhibiting insulin during the night, that suggests that the body is shifting over to fat burning. However, the suppression, in other words, melatonin suppressing insulin, means that consuming a high carbohydrate meal or snack or drink late at night, especially right when melatonin levels are about to start climbing as we get ready for bed, that can lead to very poor blood sugar control. And then, of course, as this continues night after night, we have insulin resistance settling in. Now, it's no surprise to learn that sleep deprivation complicates the relationship between melatonin and insulin as it disrupts melatonin's natural production and release. So normally melatonin is secreted during the night in some alignment with the sleep-wake cycle, which in turn plays a protective role in regulating insulin sensitivity and glucose fat metabolism. However, insufficient sleep or poor sleep will suppress melatonin secretion, not allowing it to get as high. In this state, melatonin you don't have that modulating influence of melatonin on insulin signaling. This disruption can, of course, impair the body's response to insulin, which in turn contributes to insulin resistance. But even further, the decrease in nighttime insulin suppression, typically mediated by melatonin, can lead to glucose dysregulation. So all of this together, of course, can help explain why chronic sleep deprivation is so strongly linked to an increased risk of type 2 diabetes and other metabolic disorders, further emphasizing the critical role of sleep in maintaining metabolic health. So it should never be a tiresome topic when you're, as much as we should focus on nutrition, what you eat and how often you eat it, there will always be room in that conversation for optimizing metabolic health for sleep. Now, with this in mind, I wondered whether you might be wondering about the role of melatonin supplementation. And there are, in fact, studies to show that melatonin supplementation can improve sleep quality in individuals who don't sleep well. If someone's a good sleeper, melatonin will do nothing. In fact, it may even make things worse. But if you're a bad sleeper, there could be room for melatonin supplementation to improve sleep. But the degree to which it's going to improve metabolic health, we're going to speculate, and I'll mention some studies now, but there's not a lot out there. Even still, there's some evidence to show that melatonin supplements can improve insulin sensitivity and glycemic control, particularly when it comes to managing conditions like type 2 diabetes. Studies have revealed that melatonin enhances insulin signaling, reduces fasting glucose, and lowers insulin resistance in both animals and humans. Now, of course, we prioritize the human data. And in that instance, in diabetic patients, melatonin supplementation was shown, and this study will be in the show notes for those who have access. It's been shown to reduce fasting glucose and actually improve markers of oxidative stress, all while improving insulin sensitivity. This study even went a little further and looked at a melatonin supplement group with and without exercise. And of course, combining it with exercise made things even better. Now, having said that, and as I mentioned, the evidence isn't entirely clear. There's a little evidence to show some variability in this response. And it might be because of the dose. So there was a different study that found a reduction in insulin sensitivity in people with type 2 diabetes after long-term high-dose use. So this certainly underscores the nuanced and personal view that we need to have when it comes to melatonin, that it's not just more of a good thing will solve the problem. The solution might be in the dose of the melatonin. But it does suggest that melatonin could be a valuable adjunct, if you will, adding a modest addition to improving metabolic health if someone needs a little fine tuning in their lifestyle. All right. Now, distinct from the material I've just covered, I want to highlight some evening activities that have a direct and indirect impact on metabolic health and sleep. So this is shifting the paradigm a little bit, whereas I have been talking about how sleep or poor sleep impacts metabolic health. I want to talk about how metabolic practices, specifically what you eat, can in turn affect sleep. So the first part of this, with a few topics here, is the problem of hyperglycemia and evening and preparation for bed. So many of us, unfortunately, myself included, experience a craving for carbohydrates, especially something that is sweet and gooey or crispy and salty in the evening. This isn't unnatural. It is pretty common, which is why I'm even mentioning it. And it appears to be driven at least partly by circadian rhythms, where you have glucose levels that change throughout the day, and it's not uncommon for people to naturally have this drop in their glucose levels in the later afternoon and early evening, which in turn can drive this craving for carbohydrates. So there's a bit of an internal clock that we have to kind of fight against in addition to these foods just being very craveable. And there's an entire neurobiology, of course, of carbohydrate addiction. All of that plays into this. Unfortunately, eating high carbohydrate foods late at night will cause a blood sugar spike. That's not surprising. But what might be surprising is that this triggers a surge in insulin, no surprise, but also the activation of the sympathetic nervous system. Now, that's the part of your nervous system that's responsible for the so-called fight or flight response. Now, it's not surprising to think that that's a problem, because when the sympathetic nervous system is active, it's raising your heart rate. So the heart is beating faster and harder, and it activates body temperature. That is a terrible situation to be in when you're trying to fall asleep. In other words, if you are going to bed in a hyperglycemic state, that hyperglycemia, by activating the sympathetic nervous system, is going to make you hot and anxious. So you're lying there uncomfortably warm while your heart is beating hard and you're wondering, why am I so anxious? You're not anxious about anything. You've just activated your sympathetic nervous system, making you feel anxious, even though mentally you may be perfectly quiet in your brain, but your body's not letting you rest. Because, of course, if you want to go to sleep, you need the parasympathetic nervous system to predominate rather than the sympathetic. You want the rest and digest to be leading the charge, or to be more predominant at that time of the day than the fight or flight. All right, now another topic you've heard of before when it comes to sleep is blue light. And this is another factor that can disrupt sleep and metabolism. And so this exposure is coming from screens like phones or tablets or computers. Blue light will suppress melatonin production. That, of course, is going to have the obvious effect of delaying sleep onset and perhaps compromising sleep quality. But the blue light doesn't just affect sleep. It will also worsen metabolic health. One of the studies I've cited in this found that exposure to this artificial blue light at night increased insulin resistance and impaired glucose tolerance. This certainly happens, at least in part, because of the suppression of melatonin, but it could be also other hormones that are affected because of the blue light exposure. But again, the obvious and low-hanging fruit here is that it inhibits melatonin, and if you inhibit melatonin, you're compromising some of the more optimal or normal metabolic conditions that should be predominating during sleep. All right, now the last part of this diet affecting sleep paradigm is ketones. I want to discuss this because it's such a new area of research, and that's because exogenous ketones are new. Now, just by way of background, exogenous ketones are ketones that you are taking into your body. In other words, you're drinking them. You may be familiar already with this, but anytime you hear the adjective or just the word exogenous, that means from outside the body, as opposed to endogenous, which means from within the body. So if you're on a ketogenic diet, you're making your own ketones, and thus those would be endogenous ketones. If you are drinking ketones, then it's exogenous. Now, I just have to say, because I'm such a fan and I don't have any vested interest, Original Ketone is my absolute favorite. It is a great brand. In fact, there's a coupon discount you can get. Use Ben10. It is my absolute favorite. Great company, great people. All right, now what can you do with exogenous ketones? A recent study was published in a good journal, Medicine and Science in Sports and Exercise. So you'll find this in the show notes. And they explored the effects of an exogenous ketone supplement on sleep quality and what's called architecture of sleep. And that's basically looking at the balance of REM and non-REM sleep and sleep efficiency. So the overall kind of structure of sleep during this sleep phase. And what was an interesting addition to this is that they actually did this. In other words, looking at the effects of exogenous ketones on sleep quality in athletes, and particularly those who had just been exercising, so heavy training periods. Now, you may be thinking, well, I'm not a heavy trained athlete. I'm not either, and yet I still think these data are valuable and provide some good insight. So the study involved cyclists performing a day of intense exercise, including some high-intensity interval training before bed. So this was some evening training. Now, I know a lot of you do train in the evening. That's fine. That's fine, but it might be an opportunity. If you notice that you do evening training and you don't sleep particularly well, then this could absolutely be for you. Now, what they did beyond the training is the study participants consumed the exogenous ketone drink or a placebo immediately after the exercise and about 30 minutes before sleep. So this was a fairly late workout. What did they find? There were two main findings that I think are worth highlighting. One, they found that the sleep efficiency improved. The ketone ester reduced wakefulness after sleep onset by approximately 90% compared to the placebo. So a pretty dramatic improvement in sleep efficiency. At the same time, they noticed that REM sleep duration increased. So the strenuous exercise, when they went to bed and after exercising without the ketone, it reduced their REM sleep by 26%. But when they took the exogenous ketone supplement, it restored the REM sleep. In other words, despite the workout, they ended up sleeping as well as they would have otherwise in the absence of the extreme workout in the later part of the day. So overall, what they conclude by way of mechanism, like in other words, what explains this improvement, in the paper, the authors suggest that the ketones enhanced dopamine synthesis, which has been shown to happen. Ketones have been shown to enhance the viability of dopaminergic neurons, or the dopamine-producing neurons. But by increasing dopamine, there's the speculation that helps regulate the transition between the sleep stages. That is one of the things dopamine does do. And thus, perhaps the ketones could provide or in addition to that, ketones could provide a stable energy source for the brain, rather than the brain being subject to perhaps the ups and downs of glucose at night. If a person has adapted to ketones or just have ketones at all, then that's a steady fuel for the body, because ketones aren't going to follow the dramatic changes that glucose does. So the final conclusion from that paper certainly is that the evidence suggests that exogenous ketones could be a promising non-drug intervention for improving sleep, especially if someone's experiencing disruptions due to exercise or general stress, perhaps. All right, now let's wrap up the lecture. In conclusion, sleep and metabolic health are deeply connected, and poor sleep disrupts glucose regulation, elevates cortisol, and that is a primary component to the insulin resistance that follows poor sleep. Factors like hyperglycemia before bed or blue light exposure, melatonin supplementation, or factors that are influencing melatonin levels, these all play crucial roles in this interesting dynamic. But I submit, with this information in mind, by making some small changes, simple, if not always easy, like timing your meals a little better, avoiding glucose spiking snacks within at least a couple hours of going to bed to give your glucose levels time to come back down, reducing some screen use, and depending on your own stress and exercise routine, perhaps exploring some exogenous ketones. I think you can be confident that you're taking some pretty valid steps to improve your sleep and your metabolic health. Thank you for joining me on the Metabolic Classroom. Until next time, more knowledge, better health.